Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to the ShipTech session. Is the zero carbon future a slow shipping future? Brought to you by the Maritime Online series. I'm Gary Howard, Europe editor at Seatrade Maritime News, and I'll be your host and moderator for the next 60 minutes, where we discuss decarbonisation in the maritime sector. I'll start by thanking our esteemed panel for joining us. I can see them backstage raring to jump in. A few housekeeping notes before we get into that, though. There's a Q&A function, which you'll see on the right-hand side of your broadcast. If you're in full screen, then you might need to minimize that just to get in there and ask your questions. I'll be monitoring the questions myself and putting them to the panel during the course of the debate. So get your questions in early and we'll get through as many as we can. If you're worried about taking notes, don't panic. This will be available on demand, so you can share it with your colleagues who couldn't make it live today. With that covered, let's bring in the panel and get straight into it. Good morning, panel. I'll skip the boring bit of going through all of the speaker bios word for word. They are here somewhere up there on the website if you want to check them all out. Instead, I'm going to start with a bit of a softball question to each of the panelists so that we get to know who they are and where they're coming from in this debate. And first, I'm going to go over to Di Gilpin and ask her about smart green shipping, what it is you guys do over there, and your objectives when it comes to decarbonising shipping.
Hello, Gary. Thank you. And good morning, everybody. And great to be here and have you all with us. So I'm Diane Gilpin, and I have a long history in technology and innovation. I worked on the launch of the cellular technology, the cell phone business in the UK back in the day before phones were invented. I've worked in F1, I've worked in offshore yacht racing, and I've worked in renewables. And we founded Smart Green Shipping out of the renewable energy industry because we could see that there was an opportunity to bring 21st century wind power into into commercial merchant marine. And we're a mission-driven organization for profit, but we work systemically. So we work across both the technology, by which I mean the hardware, the wing sails that we've been developing, and we work with digital systems. We've been working with the European Space Agency, and we also work with the financial aspects. So how do we get this stuff into the market? What do the customers want to see? So the first step in our journey is to retrofit a test and demonstrator ship in the next few months, or to start doing that, with the ultimate aim of doing 100% renewable power and materials ship by 2030. And that's the purpose of the company, is to be able to eventually demonstrate how we can save 0.5 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions every year.
Great, thank you. And I think that 100% renewable power and materials is probably the kind of ambition that we need to meet the targets that we need to meet as a planet. Let's go to Nick next. Nick, I suspect many in the audience are aware of Bureau Veritas and have an idea of what a classification society is. But why don't you outline the role of class in decarbonisation and maybe pick a couple of focus areas for BV at the moment?
Gary, thanks. Many thanks. Great to be with you today. Hello to everybody out there. Yes, I'm Nick Brown. I work for Bureau Veritas, which started as a classification society a long time ago. Classification societies set technical rules based on experience and research. We confirm that designs and calculations meet these rules. We survey ships and structures during the process of their construction and through commissioning, and we survey vessels at regular intervals through their operational lives to help ensure they meet and continue to meet those rules, as well as the statutory requirements that are delegated to classification societies by flag states. But of course, a huge area of work for us today is helping the industry make sure it's ready for all the new technologies and fuels that will be coming into play, principally to address the challenge of decarbonisation, of course, but combined with performance. So one of the key roles of class is to support stakeholders in identifying and addressing the risks that may be inherent in innovative approaches to decarbonisation. And there's a great deal of focus on new propulsion systems, and new fuels as well, of course, have got a lot of attention. At BV, we've been very active in supporting the introduction of LNG as a marine fuel, and the risk management guidance and expertise we developed with methane and across the gas value chain is now being applied to understand what's required to use new fuels like ammonia, methanol, and hydrogen will be next. We've released new class rules for ammonia and methanol, and no doubt hydrogen will soon follow. But of course, we're looking at much, much more than fuels. Wind propulsion, fuel cells, and much, much more are in play. And our consulting arm is supporting performance-based innovation. Well, our broader group, and we're unique as a class society in being part of a leading testing, inspections, and certification organization with 78,000 people worldwide, is able to provide analysis and verification of life cycle impacts across value chains to help organizations monitor, verify, and manage their environmental impact and performance. So it's a big landscape we're involved in. I think class societies will continue to play a key role in shaping the future of shipping. But I think one of the key factors we need to have in mind now is also working beyond the circle of our normal stakeholders. And, the ocean as well is one of the planet's most sustaining and majestic resources. That's a line from a very progressive shipowners website. And I think increasingly we need to see the ocean itself as one of our stakeholders. We focus as a class society on protecting assets and lives, more recently on environmental protection. But I think we need to broaden our sense of what we're trying to do with the oceans and actually nurture it and support, healthy oceans as well as just stopping stuff going into it. So I hope that wasn't too long an introduction. Looking forward to it.
No, not at all. And you touched briefly there on the idea of working outside of our normal circles of influence. And I think partnership and cooperation is definitely something that's going to come up in the course of this discussion. And I can already see Soren nodding along there because it's something that we actually spoke about earlier this week. Soren, Zero North's focus seems much more immediate on the fuel saving side and the money saving side, and therefore carbon savings. Improvements that we can make to the existing fleet. Could you give us an outline of Zero North's work and its significance in decarbonisation?
Yeah, thank you again, Gary, for inviting me and joining. We're very delighted to be here. So in Zero North, what we do is very much building software for the transshipping industry in order for a vessel to get most optimal from A to B. And when you begin to look at that and how many pieces of data that goes into it, is quite significant. And that's what we're putting together into one data platform and converting it into software that is kind of telling the vessel operator, what should I do now and what's the impact of my decisions. And that is very much short term, because we have a strong belief that we can already now do quite a lot of work on optimizing the current ways of the fleet moving from A to B. And with that, we can actually save significant emissions on that. While we're doing it, we will gather quite a lot of data into our data platform that over time will be able to feed into some of the longer term solutions as well. So it's not just about focusing on the short term, it's also focusing on the longer term. And in the same, when you're talking about new fuels, I guess everybody can agree that they will probably be at a higher price, meaning that the whole optimization aspect of making sure you spend as little as possible will be even more significant. So I think it's not only short term, but it's also gearing the data side for the longer term, and that's really what we're doing in Zero North for speed optimization, weather routing, and then also where, when, and how much to bunker. So really building a platform for the commercial operator to be like an optimizer and bring value to their companies.
Thanks very much. And I think even in the chat we had just before this started, I didn't realize that the further implications of the kind of data that you are gathering and how useful that can be in the future. Again, we will definitely cover that as we go forward. But why don't we move on to sort of answering the title question for this session, which is whether a zero carbon future means slower shipping in the future. And perhaps, Di, if you'd like to take a swing at that one first.
Yeah, Thank you, Gary, and really interesting to hear from my fellow panelists. Picking up on Soren's point about short-term and long-term, I think one of the things we need to bear in mind is that every journey starts with a single step, and like Soren and Zero North, what we're looking at is starting work on this program of decarbonisation means we start today, and that learning from that process enables us to build out new solutions and new technologies, and that's what we're doing with the Wind Assist program. But I think, if we're thinking about slow steaming, we need to think about what shipping's about. What's the purpose of shipping? Shipping is a facilitator of global trade, and what's global trade going to do in the face of the climate emergency? And I think that's a huge unknown. We're seeing all sorts of aberrations in the way that shipping's working at the moment globally. So I think there's a whole systemic piece that we need to be bearing in mind, that as we move into an energy constrained future, we may be seeing more products and services, or more products made close to shore, more nearshoring. What are the implications for shipping there? We might be seeing different trade patterns. We might not be consuming quite so many finished goods because we have societal suggestions that we should be consuming less. I think there's a whole global trade thing that we need to be thinking of. And so when we're thinking about making ships to work in that system, we need to be thinking about making them adaptable. And part of that has got to be around moderating the speeds so that they arrive on time in port, so we don't use waste fuel screaming across oceans only to wait outside. I think we need to be thinking about all sorts of smart ways. And as Nick said, there's lots of industry tech capability, and that that's why we've been working with the Space Agency. They know how to manage fuel consumption in outer space. So what can we learn from that sector? What can we learn from yacht racing? What can we learn from renewables? There's all sorts of areas. So I think we need to be able to be adaptable. That's the key thing. And slow steaming is something that we can do right now, today. And it is without doubt that we are in the midst of a climate emergency. And I think you only have to look at the news to figure that out. So it is a business proposition. We do need to be thinking about how we make money in responding to these situations. But we do need to act quickly. And I think we need to be doing something in the short term, which could be slow steaming, whilst thinking about the long term, holding the long term in focus simultaneously. So it's not easy, but it's a little bit like Formula One, really. You go and do motor racing every other week, but you're still thinking about your car for next year. How are you going to improve it? How are you going to beat the Ferrari, and so on? So yeah, slow steaming now to buy us a bit of breathing space, literally.
Yeah, and like you say in the Formula One metaphor, you can't just stop what you're doing at the minute, because if we stopped shipping, then the world would be in quite a lot of trouble. But you mentioned slow steaming there quite a lot, so why don't we go over to Soren next, as I suspect optimizing speed is quite heavily part of what it is you do over at Zero North.
Totally, yeah, and it is the core element of optimizing, and that's where you do have the biggest potential. And it's quite fun to see. I don't know if it's fun, but at least factual based is that when you have an industry like the dry bulk sector that has really had very high earnings in this part of the year, one thing that is certain is that they're not slowing down because of the environment. They will follow the dollar, right? And the shipping is a very dollar-driven business, and they will take decisions based on how much money they can make, which is sound business, right? So we need to make sure that the CO2 emission savings goes hand in hand with the US dollar, and I think that is the combination that we need to look at in order for us to have an impact. So it's slow shipping the future. No, I don't think it's the future at all. I think it's around making sure that we connect, and I think, as I was saying, connect all the different stakeholders along the value chain, being it both the open ocean optimization, the port optimization, between the different, I would even call it silos within the industry. So making sure that people are aligned between those that need the cargo, those that transport them, and those that actually own the vessels. Today, we are seeing an industry that is not aligned on the incentives. So you have an example, you have the owner that is not having the incentive of actually optimizing the vessel to any larger degree because they're not buying the bunkers when they time charter out the vessel. So I think some of those, that's where we need the data to really have that concurrency so that people can collectively be optimizing together across the value chain. And I think that is where we don't need as such maybe to slow down. We just need to make sure that everybody is incentivized and thereby we will optimize. And then when it comes to the future where you're having another type of fuels that actually doesn't have the emissions, then definitely will not be the question of slowing down either.
It sounds like there might be a dog nearby that agrees with you quite strongly.
I have to apologize for that, Gary. Sorry.
Okay.
I can't control it. It's my wife's, the love of my wife's life. It's somewhere down in the house and it's loose.
No problem at all. I could still hear Soren quite clearly. That's quite an interesting point because we often talk about efficiency in terms of fuel saving as straight money saving, but as, like you say, depending on how the markets change, there is a tipping point there as to what is the most commercially effective way of operating a vessel. And you mentioned the dry bulk sector. I'm sure tanker owners at the moment are having a much different experience. But just let's go over to Nick so he can answer the session question of whether we're going to get slower as we get greener or whether that's the answer.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and you see, trends for slow food, slow wear, elsewhere, as I think people are fighting back against a sort of fast consumerism. This question of incentives is going to be vital. And I think the question of what the appropriate speed is for a ship, it is just one factor in that equation. And you can see that proponents, for example, of fourth generation atomic power are selling the idea that ships could go at 30 plus knots, and that might be a more efficient use of the assets. You get more cargo carried faster. So I think that will come back to those incentives again. What is the financial imperative that's driving ship owners to make decisions on speed, for example, will have to be hand in hand with their charterers. But also, more broadly, what will the shipping industry of the future look like? And will there be more shipping? Will there be less shipping? I think those will be factors as well. And you can see that in the broader global discussion, about how to reduce carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions, that shipping may be part of the solution. That it may be better to grow tomatoes somewhere where the sun shines, rather than trying to do it. I apologize. I think the dog walker's arrived. That it may be better to grow tomatoes where the sun shines and ship them rather than trying to put in lots of inputs, in colder northern greenhouses. So it might be slower, but maybe it should be faster.
And that's one of those structural changes that I suppose will need to be led by proper research and data, because you mentioned this idea of growing produce where the sun shines. I think the example you gave was growing tomatoes in Spain instead of putting in trying to grow them in Holland in great big intensive farms. But then there's another side to that, isn't there, where I think Di and I have spoken in the past about this idea of fish being caught in the UK, shipped over to Asia for processing, and then shipped back over here to be sold. And shipping's really at the heart of the commercial equations that make those things possible. Di, we've definitely spoken about how the market is going to change in the future and how availability of fuel might shape the market in the future. How are you positioning your wind and wind assisted technologies? What sort of market do you expect them to operate in?
Yeah, thank you. I think there's a really interesting, and I can't quite articulate it, so forgive me. I haven't had enough coffee yet. But to Nick's point about the value of slow steaming. If there's a price on carbon, then you might find that it's financially sensible to go a bit slower. And when we were doing the work on the feasibility of the fast rigs, we had both the ship owner and the cargo in the room, and the conversation became really interesting around because our cargo owner Drax has a strong commitment to reduce carbon, and that translates into money. And so there's a bunch of factors about, well, it might be, we might not be able to use the port when we get there, so let's go a little bit slower, and then we can monetize the carbon savings that we do from that. And one of the key aspects of using wind is that you can either use the wind power to save emissions, or you can use the wind power to augment the engine power and travel at the same speed, but not use any more emissions than you would if you were on 100% fuel, whatever flavour fuel you're using. So I think we've got an opportunity to and Soren's point about collaborating across the whole value chain to start those conversations and to be much more dynamic about where can we save carbon and what does that do to, where can we save greenhouse gas emissions, I should say, because I think it's dangerous to just focus on carbon. But where can we save emissions, and how do we moderate the speed collaboratively? So looking at what the shipper needs to achieve and what the ship owner needs to achieve. And I think that's a rather unexplored territory, and where the value of the data and the fuel optimization and the wind optimization can come into play, and we can bring that to bear. We can bring that information to those actors through digitalization, and that is a wholly unexplored area, which I think is really interesting. So yes, wind is a power source. Any ship that's equipped to harness it can make use of it for free, and so it reduces the amount of fuel that you need to use. But then you can start playing games or playing tunes with the way that you optimize it. I don't know if any of that made sense. It's quite clear in my mind, but it's an often misunderstood aspect of wind power, that it's not just about thrust, but it's about you could go faster and use the same amount of fuel, or you can go slower and save a lot more.
Yeah, and that it's quite difficult to hold all of those ideas in your head and try to apply those to the market and work out what happens if vessel A decides that actually it doesn't need to burn any fuel, and vessel B decides it's going to burn some fuel as well and try and get there a bit quicker. Those are questions that are going to be answered, I think, in the market.
Well, and I think also, sorry to interrupt, but with digitization, and I think it's very akin to motor racing. I mean, that's kind of the stuff that we did on the pit wall, is how do you make sure your car is not consuming fuel so it doesn't run out of fuel before the end of the race, optimizes the performance, doesn't overburn the tire. So all of those things are not exclusive, all those complexities are not exclusively applied to shipping. They're applied in all sorts of areas, and there's areas that we can learn from. It is complex, but there are systems, and Soren's company is demonstrating it, that we can start to make better use of, so that we can start to introduce new sorts of energy. So wind and hydrogen, for example, might work together to bring the operating cost of a vessel somewhere back in the same ballpark cost as a fossil powered ship. That's the kind of unknown that we're working towards.
Yeah, I think it's difficult actually to get an idea of where the industry is at the moment, because there was a press release from Wärtsilä a couple of weeks ago saying that they'd completed, in cooperation with their partners, their first smart arrival at port, where the speed of the vessel and its arrival time was all optimized digitally, to reduce time in port. And I remember reading this and thinking, I sort of assumed this was already happening. This seems like quite an easy win. Why haven't we done this before? But I guess they're incredibly complex questions to answer. And maybe, Soren, you could give us an idea of how Zero North manages to sort of break down these complexities to give actionable answers that end up saving money, carbon, and all the rest of it.
Yeah, so the complexity is huge, right? Because compared to now, if we stay on the track, right, it's a known track, it's a known car. Here in shipping, it is like uncharted territories all the way, because like the ocean keeps on changing, the environmental, like the environments that the vessel are operating in keeps on changing. The vessels are not operated by the same people because it's being time chartered over and over again. So it's new people operating the vessels. So it's just a constant change, meaning that in our mind, there's so many low-hanging fruits already by just empowering those that actually take the decisions here and now. And as you empower them, you get more data back that will feed itself it call it like a data flywheel effect, that the more data you're getting in, the better the recommendation comes out. You all know that when you're doing your Google search, you're using Google search because that is definitely the one that is having the most data that will give you the most accurate answer back. And I'm not saying that Zero North is there at all at the moment, but that is the same idea of being able to generate a data platform that yields more and more data, so the use cases that you are asking it will come out being stronger and stronger. And then why has that not happened? And you're saying, yeah, but we thought that was already happening in the shipping industry. It's not happening because the industry is very fragmented. If you just take the vessel owner is fragmented, that part of the industry is fragmented. The operators are fragmented. And now you bring in the port element that is even more fragmented. And all of the data is not in one place, and it's not in any shareable format, because each one of them are having the data in their own format. And that's why we have to work together. We have to have standardization of the data, and we have to be able to share data with each other through APIs, so that we actually can, in each one of our own use cases, can build on the same data set and thereby begin to empower those that's actually taking the decisions. So it is very, very complex because of the fragmentation of the data, because of the vast variety of the industry. And that's also what I've talked quite a lot about is around being able to attract super senior talented people to the industry. And when we talk talented people, it's not just it's not talented shipping people. It's actually talented algorithmic people or AI people, and people that want to come into the industry and can see that they can help and empower the industry to take better decisions. And I think that's very, very motivating and for people to work with these challenges, that is such a big industry, but a few people can make a huge impact.
And I know you've mentioned before that despite Zero North being very much focused on saving money for its clients, when it comes to recruiting people on the tech side of things, they're actually quite motivated that it's essentially solving a puzzle that they're doing. That in the end, if they manage to solve these puzzles well, there is a benefit to the planet from them doing their job well, and that's a motivator when it comes to recruitment. Is that right?
100%, but it is it is a dollar business, right? And people will do the decision that makes the most money. But those go, for me, these things just go hand in hand. A good common decision around how to get the vessel most optimal from A to B, being it by wind or being any, like if it's the most US dollar efficient way to do it, that's what will happen, and that's where we will save the emissions. But in order for us to do that, we need to have sharing of data. We need to have partnerships across the supply chain. And that's what definitely makes it motivating for people to come in and work with this, is that they can see that by chasing the dollar in the industry, they are also doing a huge impact on the environmental side of not only shipping, but the global environment.
And you mentioned there as well, I didn't want to gloss over it, this idea of standardization. And I know that Zero North is leading a working group to try and standardize, is it fuel models, to get a better sort of basis of comparison between various solutions that are out there. How's that work going?
Yeah, first of all, it goes very well because the industry is actually willing to come together and share their views of what could a standard look like. So when any company, any shipping company are trying to predict how to get best from A to B, they need a fuel model, being it fuel performance, being it hull cleaning, propeller cleaning, fuel optimization, anything of that tune, you need a fuel model. But there's quite a lot of different people out there that is modeling fuel consumption. So trying to predict what is actually the fuel consumption of a vessel. They all use different data to do it. Some use some weather elements, others are using other elements, and that's not what the standardization is about. It's about saying what is the accuracy of those models, and by coming together and making a standardization for that, then everybody can go back and begin to work with their models of fine-tuning them and make them even better, because now we have a common denominator of what is a good fuel model. And so we are super proud of the work and very happy that people are coming willing to come together with us on this journey and publish a white paper of saying what is actually the accuracy of that one. So and everybody's willing to download it and be fully available for any questions on that. But that's important that we can have that standardization, and it doesn't have to be a regular standardization being regulated by anybody, but it's actually the industry coming together.
Yeah, and it seems particularly strong in the decarbonisation and the green space in general that any report that comes out, instead of focusing on the outcomes of it, there's often quite a strong debate about the methodology that was used as a means to kind of undermine the outcomes. I suspect that this kind of level playing field, this standardization on fuel models must be something that you're quite interested in for your own work.
Absolutely, we are. But before that, I just would like to pick up on this idea of complexity and fragmentation. I completely agree that is, a real challenge to the market. I completely agree that business has to be driven by the bottom right-hand corner about, financial reward, profit. But I would also suggest, there's a piece of research that came out of Cambridge University. I think it was called Discourses on Climate. And it demonstrated that so we've moved from climate denialism into this, it's all really complicated, we can't do anything yet because we haven't got enough detail about this, that and the other. And I think we do need to be starting to take action. We're in a really, really dangerous place in terms of the environment, in terms of the climate. And yeah, it is complicated and it is difficult, but we do have to act. And there's nothing better than getting on with it to start to learn. So it would be ideal if we could have a ship provided for our testbed that we had really detailed and accurate performance data from. But we know that if we put wind on it, we will save fuel. Is that 8.3 or is it 20.4? It will change. It will change from hour to hour. It will change from day to day. Is it better? Yes, it is. So we need to start acting, and at the same time. So it's that short-term, long-term thing that we talked about earlier on. We need to start action so that we can start to learn and move in the right direction. I think one of the things that really frightens me is that we say we can't do anything because we're a particularly difficult business, and this discourse around climate complexity is just another opportunity to delay taking action.
Yeah, when it comes to digitalization and a lot of other questions, there seems to be this willingness to take an incremental approach to improvement. But I suppose when it comes to the fleet and shipbuilding, the capital involved is so much larger that people are worried that if they take an incremental approach, then they end up losing out in the longer term over the 20 or 30 year lifespan of a vessel. But there must be answers out there to that question, and I guess they would come down to government. But before we move on to that bigger topic, Nick, I wondered if there's anything else you wanted to pick up on from that sort of broad standardization topic we've just covered. I mean, that seems to me like well in the wheelhouse of class.
Yeah, I mean, certainly class, and especially through IAX, has been working very hard to develop unified requirements, for all sorts of things. And one of the most recent examples, I think, is cybersecurity, for example, which reflects the increasing focus on digitalization and the importance of digitalization. And that's an area where Class is involved in helping provide the safety and security for a digitalized marine future. And there's no doubt that digitalization means data, and as Søren has said, and Di supported that, we need that data to make decisions. If I could pick up on this point about taking action now, I think that's one of the really important things that Di said, and you see it in the LNG discussion. Is LNG a suitable fuel for shipping, with a lot of people for or a lot of people against it? I think it certainly fits in the bucket of taking action now, but clearly some of the argument is over measuring the impact and uncertainty over the medium to longer term future for the assets that are being designed to use LNG as fuel. And I think that's where probably we need a bit more maybe maturity in that debate. And it should be tough to criticize people, I think, who are making significant capital investments on decisions made years ago, where they certainly think they're making an impact now and also have a bridge into a future. But I think we're going to have parallel tracks, and I think that's where there is growing maturity in the industry to understand the idea, because that's why we've been so focused on fuel. I think people are hoping there's going to be just a drop-in solution and we can carry on as normal, but I think we're not going to carry on as normal, and that's the big challenge. But there's a need for these different approaches, and it will be different solutions for different markets or different sectors. But that point about taking action now that Di made, is really, really important. Søren's talking about how they're taking action now to optimize performance. So we're seeing, I think, significant changes just in the the last few months in how people are looking at this, and I think there may be grounds for more significant optimism than was the case last year.
Yeah, and taking action now is actually sort of the rallying cry at the moment, I think, of one of the big LNG lobbying groups. I don't know how much I want to open that particular.
And as a class society, we're not for or against any fuel. We're working on all of them. Our role is to help people make the best commercial decisions based on the best technical insight, really. So when we look at ammonia and methanol, we're focused mainly on the safety issues and the practicalities of how do you store it, how do you keep it at the right temperature, how do you stop it leaking, how do you make sure there aren't fires or gas clouds and so on. So sometimes class is asked to have a position on these, and we really don't have one. We're agnostic on the fuel or propulsion systems. We just want to make sure the industry understands the risks involved and help them find ways to mitigate those risks. But we do get dragged into obviously a kind of an argument of trying to support one or the other. We support our clients, we support our stakeholders, who are the ship owners, the shipyards, and the regulators primarily. And we sit in that triangle, trying to help them all, get to the decisions that are best for them. But we can't, predict what's going to be best for them. But hopefully, by helping them understand the risks and the ways to address those risks, we can, help the industry move forward. Yeah,
the discussion, especially around LNG, became a bit playground, especially in the wake of the World Bank report, which was quite anti-LNG, and I made my thoughts on that known to some stakeholders. But it feels like it should be a case of all of these solutions, because I think most people agree that there is not going to be a single answer in the future to what shipping needs. We go back to this idea of the complexity of shipping, the difference between a liner operation or a tramp operation. They're going to need different answers depending as well. Geography plays a factor, and there is never going to be a clear winner amongst all of those.
And it seems that, with the opportunity to make synthetic fuels, with abundant renewable energy, there's a reasonable argument that synthetic methane, is a bridge into the future, beyond using standard fossil fuel methane. And at the moment, in terms of ammonia and methanol, they're not being made in any quantity from renewable energy yet. And it's not to say they can't be, but it's got to happen.
Yeah, and we see that need in the ambitions that are set out by governments, by the EU, for example, very recently. But it seems that that's not necessarily followed up with the cash to properly research, to properly bring in the trials for these sort of solutions. We're at a point now where we've seen the world come together with a common cause. Well, not necessarily come together, but act against a sort of common foe in the form of COVID, where it was obviously seen as a real threat and a pretty existential threat to people, that this virus could change the world. But it's been decades of knowing about climate change, of knowing about its impacts. We've just seen these horrible heat spikes in North America that have led to many deaths. Do we need the same sort of response, the same coordinated response, the same urgency that we've had around COVID? Do we need to be applying that to decarbonisation and ramping up our efforts, but more importantly, following that up with policy changes that let us look into these solutions? I mean, Di, you must be looking to get the test beds up and running to show that you can make a real difference in transportation, which is a huge emitter of carbon emissions. Do you see enough action from the government to support those kind of initiatives?
Short answer is no. What we learned from working in the renewable energy business, so by which I mean renewable energy for power, the early days of wind turbines, which were relatively small, land-based, received government support, domestic government support, in the form of renewable obligation certificates. What that enabled was for the pioneering developers to overcome what is known as the valley of death, where innovations go to die. So it basically, what we do is we invent stuff. We're a very clever species. I mean, I'm not just talking about smart green shipping. We invent really clever stuff, but there's lots and lots of technology solutions out there that could have an impact on a dramatic and fundamental impact on addressing climate change, which don't get to market because there's no financial support, and it is completely irrational for the financial sector to support them because it doesn't fit in their financial and investment criteria, and that's perfectly sensible. So we, in the renewable energy business, we looked to the government to provide renewable obligation certificates or other mechanisms to help get through the valley of death. What we see now is fleets of offshore wind turbines that are producing electricity at a lower cost than any other form of power production. So that's what we need to be seeing in shipping. And there isn't any mechanism like that. So what we get from government is lots of fine words and lots of commitment and lots of ambition, but very little cash. And there's an argument that says, well, we don't want to make these technology providers dependent, but we're not looking to be dependent. We're looking for a specific part of the innovation cycle that needs support, so that the market, we know that the market wants to look at wind really seriously. We know that they want to buy wind if we can prove that it works. And so we need to have real world demonstrators, we need full scale demonstrators, and we need to operate for some time in order to accumulate the data that we can use to show that the technology is going to improve efficiency. So that's where we need help, and it is woefully lacking. And not just in shipping, but across the piece. So until we start to recognise that society needs to come in and fill that gap, in the way that it did with COVID, where we just threw money at the development of a vaccine. There was a history of research and development in coronavirus vaccinations, which enabled us to produce something quickly. We've got the same sort of latent technologies available to address climate change, and we just need that emergency, and it is a climate emergency, injection of cash so that we can bring some of these things to market. Not everything's going to be successful, but we need to get on with it. So I absolutely endorse the need for government support, whether that's domestic or international. We need to figure out how to get policy support to bring these technologies to market, because it is an emergency.
And Nick, you've been in class for a few years now, and it's part of the position of class that it's on top of these sort of cutting edge technologies and exposed to these sort of pioneer projects. Have you seen any change in the number of projects you see with sort of government backing behind them? Has there been any advance at all?
Well, I think certainly, one of the important areas for class is to get involved in some of the EU funded projects, and that's an area of activity in its own right every year, to get involved in the significant number of projects there. I think, what's necessary as well is that, government is working with industry through coalitions like the Energy for the Future, for example, which had an announcement last week about a large biomethane plant being set up in the port of Marseille-Fosse in the south of France. And that's where I think they've got local regulatory and government involvement with industry to try and come up with solutions that may well be, test beds for globally applicable ones. And I think, Søren, we've seen the same in Denmark with methanol, for example. So, I think government has a role to play, but they've got to find the right way to interact with the private sector effectively. And certainly shipping seems to be low down the list in most places, outside of really shipping focused areas like Singapore, I think, where the government is so involved in so much development related to the shipping industry. But elsewhere, and sitting in the UK at the moment, there's no doubt that I think there was disappointment as to where shipping was in a recent government announcement here, and the amount of practical investment that was going to be available. And I think in general, despite a lot of focus in Europe, for example, I think there's still not enough understanding as to the importance and role that shipping can play in helping decarbonise transportation into the future. In some ways, it seems we've gone backwards in terms of using the seas as our highways and canals and inland waterways as well. I think there's no doubt we could do more of that. When I was a boy, you could get a ferry from Scotland to Norway. You can't do that anymore. And that seems like a retrograde step to me.
Yeah, and often this conversation views these challenges as a threat to the industry. But you only have to look at a graph of the relative emissions of different modes of transport to see that shipping is pretty firmly down at the bottom. And so you would have thought that this is an opportunity for us rather than a threat, where we could be taking some volumes from other modes of transport.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And, shipping is so vastly more efficient. I think there's still a question about whether whether you need certain types of voyages, but generally, in principle, if you can get things on water, it's more efficient. And that is not as well understood as it needs to be. And maybe there's still a big job to be done for the shipping industry in promoting and protecting its image, which would also help in terms of its engagement with other stakeholders in terms of decarbonisation more broadly, so that we're able to position ourselves more effectively and secure a better future for shipping, but also for society.
Yeah, and
But
there have
maybe
been
so
some.
if I can give a comment, because I think if we are seeing, at least from our side, and when we engage with shipping industry, the shipping industry in itself is taking this very seriously. And a lot of initiatives are really being formed. There's a lot of coalitions, there's a lot of centers, there's a lot of like it coming out of shipping on its own, right? So I really see an industry that on a wider level know and see the need for change, and really investing in the 2030 and 2050 and the eagerness to do this as fast as possible, while at the same time day to day there's not a company that we are speaking to on a day-to-day basis now that is not having this on the agenda. And I would even say within the last year, when we spoke to companies saying, hey, how do we do something, and how do we optimize for CO2 emissions now? Last year they would say, yeah, but that's not of our interest. And now they're saying, hey, what can we actually do, right? So there's a very, very fast shift going on within the industry. And I think we are in some way fairly lucky of the industry being, as you already mentioned, fairly heavy on CapEx. So people know that it takes a lot of investments, and there is a lot of risk willingness capital within the industry itself to test and try some of the futures, right? So all of that, I do see an industry that both short-term want to use the data, can see the need to build up the data to do something for the longer purpose, but also are investing because it will become good business to actually lower the emissions.
Go on, Di. Yep.
Completely endorse that. Every individual that I've ever spoken to in shipping wants to do something. And what I'm saying is that we need government support to enable us to do it faster. That's really the point. There's no criticism at all about anybody that I've ever met. We really want to do something. But unlike the renewable power domestic industry, where there was a pathway of incentives to decarbonise, there is not that as yet in shipping. There is R&D funding support available through Europe, as Nick points out. There is R&D funding available in various other places, but it's very competitive, and as it should be. I'm not saying we should be, investing in all sorts of rubbish, but it's not a systemic approach to the goal of decarbonisation. So empower this fantastic industry to get on with it is really what I'm saying.
Yeah, and Soren, you mentioned earlier there are ways that we can de-risk these questions we need to answer by the application of data. One thing that you mentioned that I hadn't considered at all is that the data that you have access to, especially on the bunkering side of your operations, means that when it comes to making decisions on where, when all of these new fuels come along, if and when they do, and whatever form they take, you can give some pretty strong advice on where those bunkers need to be and how much of it we're going to need.
Yeah, so it's very easy when you are beginning to look at not easy is maybe the wrong word, but it's more simple to look at putting some of the new fuels into play to go for the larger vessels, go for container liners, because they know where they're going, they know where they're bunkering. But I think sometimes in these discussions, we are forgetting there is around 33,000 vessels in the tramp shipping industry that is of various sizes and is being traded with owners not buying the bunkers, but being time chartered out. So it's, again, very fragmented. And those vessels are bunkering in so many other places than in the main 2 or 3 bunker hubs. So what we're saying through our platform, where we are guiding the operator where, when, and how much to bunker, that data set can, of course, be fed back on an aggregated level to potential new vendors that will come into the industry and saying, where is it most economical? Where is the best place to set up a supply chain? And how do you actually bring them to market? So what is actually the customers that can actually buy these products? Because, again, they are changing hands. So I think it's just another example of how data aggregated can help the future design of solutions.
Absolutely. I think probably at the base of this whole conversation really is consumers. We are the reason that these ships are going backwards and forwards, whether it be because we need to heat our homes or we want the latest gadgets to play with. How important are consumers in this conversation? And are consumers able to have enough of an influence on the solutions that we're putting forward? I feel like probably not, but I wondered if anybody else had any other views on that. Nick, perhaps if you'd like to pick it up.
Yeah, I'm hoping the dog's going to stay quiet. The consumer is really important, and you know what's interesting, I think, in dealing with our stakeholders increasingly is that the gap between the corporate manager you're talking to and the sense of someone being a citizen is narrowing. You know that increasingly we're talking to the citizen inside everybody, and I think that's a change, and we'll see that accelerate as younger generations mature. I think that the sense that society will get the shipping industry it deserves is a fact that shipping probably can't move that much faster, but it certainly shouldn't move any slower than developments we're seeing elsewhere. The decarbonization of deep sea shipping is going to be a tough job. How you make the consumer aware of that, I think, is tough as well. Shipping's vital. The industry to some extent is vulnerable because of various structural realities, and we've seen through the pandemic how we've been unable to protect our key workers, our seafarers, effectively. So I think there's a lot for shipping to do. How we can make the consumer more aware, maybe is something we need to think about.
And if I can add, just a very quick note, because I think, again, for tramp shipping being like 33,000 vessels, 375 million tons of CO2 emissions, I think there you are way far away from the consumer, right? Because do you realize how much of your car that you have of the aluminium and steel that was actually transported on a vessel, or any of the woods that we have transported on longer journeys, right? Or as you're saying, where does oil, where does chemicals, all of that has been transported. 90% of that has been on a vessel before you've consumed it, right? And I honestly, there in that part of the industry, I do see the consumer being too far away, and that we don't have a clear link between that kind of, it's too far down in the supply chain to really care about it, where the consumer is much more closer when you are buying your sneakers, because there that they came from a container from one place to another, right?
Yeah, but even in that sector, perhaps when it comes to containers, there's not enough exposure there. I've spoken to people in the past who said, yeah, when I buy my Nikes, if there were a box I could tick there that I was confident, I could spend an extra few dollars and guarantee that I'm offsetting, or in some way preventing carbon or greenhouse gas emissions by spending the extra couple of dollars, then I do it every time. But the option isn't there yet. I have seen some initiatives that are sort of creeping up from the other end to shippers from the shipping lines, but it seems like there's still quite a big gap to bridge there. And perhaps the answer lays in these digital solutions.
Gary, just quickly on that, can I say, I think that's where the consumer in each of the companies you're dealing with, in those tramp shipping companies, may be becoming increasingly a factor. That people will start thinking about their role in society as well. One would hope, to get to at least help try and secure that change.
True, and they might be faced with the difficult proposition of balancing that against their duty to shareholders, or their desire to make profit. Again, going back to what we said right at the beginning about this idea of bulker rates going straight up, and so ships going faster. And if you look at the big picture, a big component to the bulker trades is coal, and in a decarbonizing world, you would expect at some point there's going to be less coal shipped.
But that also very much comes down to the employees, right? The shipping companies, being citizens, they also understand that the shipping companies have to do something around this, otherwise they can't attract talent, right? People don't want to work from emission polluting companies.
Being sort of pressured from many fronts. We are just coming up to 60 minutes. I'm afraid we're going to have to cut us off there. But thank you all for your insights and answers. I've really enjoyed our conversation. I'm sure I have some housekeeping outro-y bits to do. Yeah, here they are. Firstly, thanks to the panel. I've really enjoyed our conversation and great to get it covered from a few different perspectives there. Don't forget the session will be available on demand here on the Maritime Online Series platform. So if you found the session valuable and enjoyed our conversation, then share it with your colleagues who couldn't make it live. The series is still running. Please do check out the rest of the live content coming up next week. And we have plenty of on-demand content, some of it including my beautiful face as well. Check through the agenda pages here and you'll see everything that's happened and everything that's coming up. The next live session will take place next Wednesday with Seatrade Maritime News Virtual Marine Insurance. Are business models still fit for purpose? I suspect some questions being asked in the wake of Ever Given. And if you can't get enough of ShipTech and of me, I'm back same time next week for a discussion on the role that finance plays in green shipping, which should be another great conversation. A pretty significant angle on a similar topic. And then finally, a quick reminder to let you know that calls for entries for both the Seatrade Awards and the Seatrade Maritime Awards Middle East, Indian Subcontinent and Africa are both now in association with Lloyd's List. Entries still open there, but deadlines are looming, so please do make sure you enter ahead of the deadlines, which can be found on the respective websites. Thank you all for watching and for taking part, and until next time, thanks and goodbye.